Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I'm thrilled to be here chatting to Jasmina. I should say that Jasmina and I know each other from the British art scene. We sit on the board of a fantastic public art gallery up in the northeast of England called the Baltic Centre, which does amazing work in a very, very impoverished community, bringing cutting-edge contemporary art to this very difficult area, which voted Brexit in overwhelming numbers. And we have managed to get a very large percentage of people from impoverished backgrounds to come and see quite exciting contemporary art through doing lots of outreach. And so it's I'm the chair of the board, and she's one of my trustees, and she's a fantastic person to have on that. And I always enjoy conversations with Jasmina, and we've just been in Graz together for the festival there, Steirischer Herbst Festival, Contemporary Art Festival, where Jasmina has a piece and a performance. Jasmina Cibic is a Slovenian installation and film artist. She lives and works in London. She's exhibited all over the world, including here in Austria, and she was chosen by Slovenia to represent her country at the 55th Venice Biennale in 2013, which of course is a huge honor for any artist. Jasmina has just come from Graz, where she's been doing a performance work building on her research about culture within the Yugoslav non-aligned movement of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's a movement that was so incredibly important, but which actually we kind of tend to forget and overlook these days. Last year, Jasmina had a show at the Museum der Moderne in Salzburg with an installation entitled Most Favored Nation. Now, this is a reference to a principle used by the World Trade Organization. So you're beginning to see a theme here. A very big geopolitical ideas are a recurring feature in Jasmina's work. So she uses film and sculpture and performance and installations to examine how national identities and political rhetoric are deployed through art, architecture and culture. In other words, how countries use art and culture as a tool of soft power. Jasmina, welcome to Vienna, welcome to the Humanities Festival. Why don't we start with a little bit of background on yourself. Where did you grow up and where did you study?
Thank you, Kirsty. Thank you for the invitation. So I feel a little bit out of place because I don't have any images to show you. So I will do my best. I hope it's not too much as baptism with fire. So it's good to,
You're going to have to do a lot of describing.
Yes, I will use my hands a lot as well, probably. But yes, I come from Ljubljana, Slovenia. So I was born in former Yugoslavia. My country doesn't exist anymore. And as Ilya Kabakov really lovely once put, every artist compensates what is lacking. So I have spent the last 20 years trying to recreate a system, an idea of, let's say, an existent, functioning exchange system of critical thought. So coming from Ljubljana, I decided not to try and study at the Academy in Slovenia because it was, let's say, it was following sort of like old tropes of what methodologies of, not methodologies of contemporary art, but, you know, methodologies of production of craft or skills, but not of the, let's say, the reapplication of those skill sets to contemporary concerns. So I went to Italy. I was at the Academy of Fine Arts in Venice for 5 years, and then I went to Goldsmiths to do my MA. And this is, I guess, where...
In London.
In London, where my... let's say, fight with this idea of the expectations of cultural capital of artistic practices started. So when I came to Goldsmiths, the main, let's say, message from the kind of professorial cohort was, oh, you come from Eastern Europe, so you will do political art in a poor material, preferably cardboard. So as any good artist, I said no, and I built up an aesthetic which was really trying to recreate the system, including its methodologies, aesthetics. So I create quite large film installations, films themselves, scripts, plays, but everything I try to place within systems of power. So I am quite obsessed with architecture of national and transnational power. So I've done works in parliaments, in United Nations Palace in Geneva, in the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw. So this idea of using the power brokers that usually are the ones that choose on how culture can perform, I try to create a double game and step into an active conversation with them.
I mean, it sounds like, I mean, it's interesting what you said about your lecturers at Goldsmiths, that there was a sort of, almost an element of sort of exoticism about kind of, oh, well, she's from a former war zone, this is what she's going to do. How was the experience of coming from, you know, former Yugoslavia, followed by the war in the 90s, when there was no, you know, a very little state-subsidized art or art market? I mean, how did this impact on your journey as an artist? Would it have been very different had you, say, been a German artist or a French artist or a British artist?
So I was 10 when the war in Yugoslavia happened, so I was a little bit young to kind of feel it within the work itself, but it was resonating for a really long time. So the generation of artists that were only a few years older than me kind of fell into this space of the expectation of the developed art context of the trauma art. So I don't know if you remember, there were these series of exhibitions that were titled In the Gorges of the Balkans was a very famous one, Blood and Honey was another one. And funnily enough, we're getting back to titles called The Cold of the Balkans. So we are again experiencing nostalgia coming back. You know, these ideas of, you know, what do we expect from the other? And I guess, you know, because we are fundamentally speaking now of this kind of art context, you know, the art and cultural context always, you know, thrived on difference, right? So, you know, this idea of geopolitical exotic packaging, especially for the art market, but sometimes also for critical thought, was and is still quite present, I find. And, you know, for artistic practices, if you want to be, you know, true to the artistic practice, you don't change with the weather. So at the moment, you know, if you were kind of following funding, you will be doing works related to climate change or to robotics or AI or gender. So it's very interesting to observe this sort of meandering of artistic and cultural practices for the possibilities of funding. Now I'm mentioning this because, of course, there's different markets. There is the market of production of objects or, you know, work with private galleries. But for research-based practices, which are the ones I'm interested in, because I think that, you know, this is what, you know, we really want to achieve is communication and new audiences and hopefully actually, you know, affect the next generations and inspire them as well. This is where it's becoming trickier and trickier because the funding is closing down. And there was just news from Scotland this morning that they are, the Creative Scotland, which is sort of their kind of culture ministry in a way, that funding is not coming through. So, you know, this is okay going out of, you know, specifically this context, but, you know, it's not only Eastern Europe, it's not only, you know, former Yugoslavia or Poland or Hungary that are experiencing these sort of monosyllabisms which are being imposed by the public financing, but also developed countries. So we are entering into this, like, I think, quite specific and very dangerous situation where, I mean, of course, artists have to live. So, you know, you can't eat your CV.
I was going to come actually to ask you next about how Brexit has impacted on the art scene in Britain and specifically on you. I mean, has it impacted on the sort of exhibitions that people are curating?
So initially, I think the worst thing that what Brexit did is to the students. So when you look at the academies or the art schools, whoever now studies, I mean, there are hardly any Europeans left. When I was doing my MA at Goldsmiths, it was probably about 70 people, all already formed artists, amazing practices. Probably about 50 of them were from Europe. So now that number is completely decimated.
Because it's just too expensive now.
It's too expensive, but it's also, it's very, I mean, this is the funny thing, how quickly things slide. And we can observe it even like with Venice Biennial. You know, you have a country that one year has a a candidate that is kind of promoted by some right-wing prime minister, and then that country will not get audiences for 5 years. And with Brexit and the kind of, whoever thought we would miscall Britannia, that's all I can say, right? It's, it goes really fast. And, you see the students that are being generated, they will not get funding once they finish the universities. They will not be able to write to Arts Council and get funds. They won't. I mean, I have been now in London for over 20 years. I cannot get funding. I cannot get funding from Slovenia because Slovenia has a system that if you're a Slovenian artist living abroad, you cannot get funding. So, this nationalism in art, specifically in art funding, I'm not talking about film, theater, or dance, but like contemporary art that is, more research-based, let's say, it's really becoming this kind of like fine tunnel of, where you can go. We lost on a project, we recently lost a grant because I was not Swiss. Once you open, again, going back to Brexit, you open the kind of possibilities for artists. It's very specifically territorially based or even local based, gender based, disability based. And it's becoming this tick box of Arts Council funding that, you need to tick to be able to apply for it. And again, we'll be fine, we're old farts, but, it's about the kids. It's about, how do you continue having this live, engaged exchange, and how can we continue being relevant? I mean, this is the other thing, on all the exhibitions that, I'm doing around Europe, or the think tanks I sit on relating to European condition, nobody gives a damn about Britain, but not only that, but also to the Europeans who are in Britain, which is probably even worse.
Yes.
Very happy note, I'm sorry.
So I just stop while I sob here about Brexit. I mentioned the Venice Biennale that you represented as Slovenia, and I know you've talked about this as a turning point in your work. So, I mean, just to explain the Biennale for non-artists in the audience, because it is, I think, the art world equivalent of the Olympics. Countries want to be seen. National pavilions display work, from nations all over the world, or at least those nations who can afford it. Was Venice the moment when you started to explore the geopolitics, of art within your work?
So what I was really interested in Venice. So Venice is in a way, I mean, for people who are not really in the kind of art world that much, it's kind of a continuation of the idea of universal world expositions, but focused only on art. So this idea of how a nation chooses an artist or an artistic proposition to represent. So I guess my whole quest was whether is it still possible for an artist to represent a nation, or what does that mean, especially when the nation is very tiny, doesn't have their PR, has 3 people running the whole pavilion, as opposed to, I don't know, the British pavilion that has a whole entourage, basically. And I like to play with the system's own code of messaging. So I created a pavilion based on solely local specifics. But I went further. I took, from the history of Slovenia, I took successful and failed national icons. So I went to the parliament and I knocked on the doors and I asked if we could borrow the art collection, so the paintings that hang behind the backs of politicians in office. But I also was interested in the paintings that never changed their position. So can you guess what they were? Still lives. Because they were the only thing that never offended anybody. So we took those paintings, brought them to Venice, to a very humid pavilion, which is another story, and we hung them in a performative intervention at the opening on the pavilion walls, which were covered with a wallpaper I produced specifically for the pavilion, which was a wallpaper depicting a little insect that lives only in 5 caves in Slovenia, and it's named after Hitler. So this is an Ophthalmus hitleri, which is an endemic cave animal that was discovered in 1937 by Oskar Scheibel, who was a Nazi sympathizer. And there's a whole big story as well, which, I mean, is also relating to this territory.
So this was Nazi beetle wallpaper?
Yes. And we had over 1 million of the Hitler's bugs, and we were saying this is how ideology works. You don't know you're looking at 1 million of Hitlers, right? Anyhow, so bringing these things together, and then I kind of made another 2 films that were reanimating certain political debates on art and how to choose artists, but from the 50s, when they built the parliament. So, I basically work with historical ready-mades, I guess, is the best way to say it. And then I bring them together in these theatrical compositions that can only exist within that space and time and condition. And I guess the biggest win that I considered of our pavilion was that the parliament had a discussion. So they had a discussion whether I was taking the piss. And this is where I was like, okay, this is interesting. Was
the discussion partly what is JASMINA CIBIC doing representing Slovenia in Venice? Was that?
Well, the funny thing was that actually so our committee so the people who decide who goes to represent, it's the same number of people and the same also gender distribution that it was in 1957 when these debates on the newly built Slovenian parliament were happening. And the uncle of the man who was really against my proposition was the guy who was really against the only artwork that was ever censored in the history of Slovenia, which was then the main protagonist in my film. So, this circularity of history and this, history does have these, looking for patterns, I guess, which is another conversation altogether. But, this kind of revisitation of censorships, of, how do we shape nationhood through, not only through local stone, local wood, but local art. This is something which is unfortunately really coming back in this territory. We all opened the newspaper this morning, right? So, now we have Slovakia and Poland's coming next. It's so, in Slovenia, we're really lucky with, the new government, we kind of just about managed to pull out, but it's fragile times. And I guess, with art and culture specifically, art and culture can be really complicit. We are not only pawns in the permutations of power, we are complicit. And I guess that's what I'm trying to bring to the surface.
Looking forward, I suppose it's about this kind of time when nations start choosing the artists who will represent them at the next Venice Biennale. What can it'd be interesting actually to sort of see, depending on what happens, the Polish elections, but who Poland chooses to represent it, who the Hungarians choose to represent, who the Slovaks. Do you see that more and more in Venice, that pavilions reflecting what is happening in a country necessarily?
So this is, I don't know how many of you are following. So these are now the weeks that the names are coming out. So the Polish selection was announced, and it is tragic. It's just absolutely tragic. And, there are amazing Polish artists.
So can you explain to us what...
So the artist who was chosen creates very religious paintings with soldiers next to a cross. That's the motivic. And, the commissioner is a right-wing, endorsed by the government. Curator who has really nothing to do with the amazing and abundant Polish production of really, really solid contemporary art. So that's Poland. Croatia is good. This sounds like, it is like Eurovision, right? Slovenia is very clever. I cannot unfortunately say who it is, but it's a very clever choice. It's very strategic. So it really is. You could, it's PhD territory. Like really observing the choices and, how this actually illustrates, then the kind of the internal cultural politics and, the current culture ministry in offices. So it's, I welcome you all. Come to Venice. You're going to learn a lot. And it's a bit like, a crystal ball of, the next at least two years.
I was thinking that last time I was in Venice that, that for some years that the Russian pavilion had been an absolute must-go-to. And then, of course, the last 2 years it's all closed and, and then, literally has kind of sort of ivy growing on it and a chain over the door. And, you focused much of a lot of your recent work on the idea of cultural gifts. Tell us about that and what you're interested in, and indeed what a cultural gift is.
This was my attempt on making a work which was very optimistic. it didn't go very well. So I was focusing on commissions for a long time. So, really, what governments ask for, what they want. And, politicians usually know what they don't want in terms of style. So I'm interested in those moments where, nation states fail or transnational organizations have a hiccup, political parties kind of go, oh, we're not sexy anymore. And they all want a new scenography, right? So they know what they don't want, but they don't know how they want it to look. So that's what I'm interested in. So these commissions, these ideas of commissions was always kind of quite a big thing for me to kind of see, well, how did they reinvent color or,
so this is sort of tracking what states commission.
Yeah, so exactly looking at, for example, former Palace of Federation in Belgrade, which was created for the first conference of the Non-Aligned, where artists and architects were given complete free rein to basically do what they wanted, to create this complete, amazing scenographic spectacle for not the British third way, the real third way, of how to, recast the world between, East and West in the 60s. Anyhow, and then I said, well, let's look at the idea of gifts. Of course, Marcel Mauss, this idea of, the gift, which of course you cannot return because then it fails to be a gift. And there's an Ezra Klein essay on vegetable money, which obviously I don't want to go into Ezra Klein, but this idea of vegetable money, he's talking about exchange. So he's talking about how, for how the idea of money that is being used to make the exchange of having the same perishability as the good for which it is exchanged for. And the idea is that, culture doesn't have wear and tear. So this kind of small little note on the idea of culture being this potential perpetuum mobile that you could kind of continuously give. And of course, culture as a gift is also or art and culture as a gift is kind of quite a, interesting story, but it usually comes from the fact that the artist makes the gift, right? Which was not, I don't like that idea, obviously, because it just doesn't work, does it? But, the whole philosophical and the, just.
And then, of course, there's the gifts that are given diplomatically by one state to another.
So this is what I was kind of more interested in. It's just the relationship around the gift giver and the receiver. And what do you do when the receiver disappears? So, okay, I'll go much more now illustrative. So I was looking at the diplomatic gifts of culture that were made to, let's say, in order for certain transnational cooperation to function. So I was looking at the gifts of art and culture created, especially I was looking at the League of Nations, because that's probably the best case study where the entirety of the project was a gift. So from the land, which was gifted by the city, to the architecture, to then the decorations of the building as well. And now, obviously, United Nations reside in this building, but it's a building which was gifted by all these different architects, member states, artists, and so on. But it is a complete illustration of European colonialism, basically, right? And they are not, because they're gifts, they cannot return them, but they are not problematizing them. So, for example, you have a gift of Belgium, which is a 1935 tapestry representing the people of the world. And it's 8 women, and the European representatives are all fully clothed, and the exotic ones are topless. And, and it just has a little tag, gift from Belgium, 1935. And it's really interesting that this whole kind of, decolonial moment, which has been around now for quite many years within the art context, within museums, is not reaching culture diplomacy.
They haven't read the memo from the Arts Council. No.
Probably. They don't have to tick the box.
So, you shot a film called The Gift, and you shot it in the Palais des Nations in Geneva and the Palace of Culture and Sciences in Warsaw. And you're telling the story of a competition, aren't you, to create a piece of art which will hold a nation together. And so an artist, an engineer, and a diplomat are stating their cases to this panel of judges. I mean, what were you attempting to explore or reveal with this work?
So it's a short-form film, which exists actually as a 3-channel installation for museums.
So it's on 3 different screens, so it feels very immersive.
So there was this idea of kind of how to bring theater then to the larger viewership. And the entirety of the film is created from gifts of culture. From protagonists, so the characters, the script, the locations, so everything was a gift. And the storyline really kind of goes, follows speeches made by diplomats, cultural diplomacy, artists, architects that were trying to create this perfect gift for whatever was the context. And the scope is there such a thing as a perfect gift of culture that can heal the nation, right? And then there's 4 judges, which are 4 fundamental freedoms that are drawn from, of course, Roosevelt's speech. And the idea is that, so the 4 freedoms were brought in as this, again, soft power hook to try to entice America to enter World War II. But of course, the idea of these freedoms also becoming, the judges, of kind of holding us accountable as well and always raising the stakes. So as soon as one of the characters comes into the space to present their idea for the perfect gift, the rules get rewritten and elevated, and it's the new Arts Council sort of rule, yeah. And yeah, we were really lucky to film, to get permits. So this is another thing that, I really try to work with institutions of power with, telling them exactly what we want to do. So these are critical projects. We are trying to really bring them up to the, platform for discussion. And the United Nations in Geneva were amazing. We were the first critical production that they let in to film. And then we filmed in the Oscar Niemeyer's communist headquarters in Paris, which was also a gift. Mount Budujle in Bulgaria, and the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw, which was a gift from Stalin to the Polish people. So they were all gifts, and also some of them are just about still holding on as edifices. Some have been also reclaimed back. So for example, Mount Budujle is a really interesting case study because the roof or the materials of it have been reclaimed by the very people who have gifted it. So there's like a lot, packed in, but the idea is that the film itself it's very narrative, let's say. It really wants to tell the story. And again, this was like a lot of talk today about this idea of how writers and artists, we are going back to wanting to tell a story that is maybe comes from something very local, but they are all very universal.
And you have sort of actors and so on, just to explain how you've got a proper sort of theatrical element to
this is without my projection here.
Yeah,
it's basically scripted theater, really. Yeah, it's very heavily scripted, and it really plays the trope of historical drama, let's say, and that subverts it.
And this sort of relates a little bit to the work you've just done in Graz. Now, this was inspired by a congress of cultural representatives of the non-alive movement that was held in Titograd, in Yugoslavia, in 1985, where artists, academics and politicians shared strategies on achieving self-determination for oppressed identities. Now, and just explain, because you used fragments of speeches, didn't you, for the libretto of a musical performance performed by 8 female singers swinging from the ceiling of the Kunsthaus in Graz. What is the story that you're trying to tell here about this particular congress in Titograd in 1985?
So I spent the last year working with this archive, which is it's a very fragmentary archive because, in former Yugoslavia, institutions still don't have the money to really properly deal with archives, basically. So what we tend to do with other practitioners, whenever somebody gets some external funding, we kind of go to the archives, make digital copies, and then upload it to the dark web of Dropbox. And it's kind of the only way how we can protect this, And
because this is, I should say specifically, there is this non-aligned archive that is still in Montenegro.
Yeah, so this is one of them, but all our archives are disappearing. And unfortunately, there was a lot of, again...
across the Western Balkans, this is an issue.
Yeah, it really is, because even the Archive of Yugoslavia, you have this amazing, you have the master plans for the city of Belgrade for the first conference of the non-aligned, which are, you can take them, it's not supervised, you can just put them in your bag. So things are really disappearing. So it's quite an epidemic in terms of that. But this specific archive in Podgorica and Montenegro, basically, it's run by 3 curators who have been there since '85, so they really are the non-aligned. They're these amazing 3 women that are about to retire, so all this knowledge is about to go away with them. And we had I don't know if you remember, MoMA did an exhibition in 2018 on Yugoslav modernism. And there's this whole geopolitical exotification in the art world of these historical ready-mades. And what these institutions do is they do this, right? And what I wanted to do is to, get in before Pompidou or somebody else would do this, and really work with the people from the region and create together a project which would, hopefully create a platform for discussion and somehow, bring down the roots and protect the archives and publish the archives. So I also work with loads of publications where we can try to then publish those archives so at least they exist in a printed form as well somewhere. So I took this archive and it's very, so yes, as Kirsty said, it's, the participants of this conference were very, very different people. There were painters from Syria, there were librarians from India, there was a cultural attaché from North Korea. It's really, really random. So also how they were selected is a bit, is that kind of culture diplomatic curatorship, which is always a bit, the objects themselves as well that are then were gifted together with when these people arrived and they were kind of then exchanging artworks and so on. They're not that interesting per se, but it's the archive which is so fascinating, and the fact that this actually happened. And when you read through these speeches that were done...
so it's not so much that the objects are of particular artistic interest, it's the narrative, it's the story of that they tell, and of that movement at that time.
And how all these people got together and how they were exchanging, basically, these quite sometimes desperate pleads of, how to protect the cultural narrative and, the local production, mostly against the Western cultural systems. So I kind of took from all these speeches, I basically took the kind of central phrases that kind of read almost like instructions on how to achieve spiritual decolonization, emancipation, and so on. So they're actually very, very optimistic and very quite high-flying, but also incredibly useful. So, for example, one of them is always employ strategies non-expensive strategies that achieve long-lasting effects. So, they're some of them are like extremely pragmatic and some are like extremely utopian. But I basically wanted to translate, because this is an archive which is very dry, you can imagine. And I thought, how can we actually elevate, how can we make it interesting, also as an invitation to other, researchers, and of course, a historical material can be just, quite flat. And what I want to do as an artist, because I know artists can do a lot of damage, when they work with historical materials. So, I really, hands up to that. So the idea is to just, kind of open it up and then really work with historians, with philosophers, with writers to together in solidarity enact it. So I basically translated it into a musical score, which I thought was a good idea. It turned out it was like one of the hardest projects I ever did. So
you worked with a composer.
I worked with a composer. I did a film where, so I translated it into a musical score, which is now enacted by an octet of female musicians, and we filmed all across former Yugoslavia within architectures which were created by the patriarchy to, let's say, entice the citizens, but also the international audiences. So they were all these like amazing architectures built in the middle of nowhere. So they're, and also they've been, geopolitically historicized as well. But I'm using them as these kind of echoic chambers for the female voice. And this is the other thing. Also in all these archives, women are not present. And whenever there's a woman that says something, even if she's a minister of culture in former Yugoslavia, it says a female voice from the background says. So for the 20 years that I've been working with this material, I am trying to really reinscribe the female voice almost as a kind of allegory of the nation states that this female body was supposedly representing into an activated voice of agency.
Now, this piece that we're talking about now, this was commissioned, wasn't it, by the Steirische Herbst Arts Festival in Graz. I mean, you've done quite a lot of work in Austria in the last sort of 2 or 3 years, and I wondered, how do you view the art scene here?
So mostly when I speak with my students, we're really talking about this idea that, when you're studying, nobody talks about who understands your code of messaging, right? And this is something which is kind of becoming like, I am becoming aware of it more and more and more, because it's obviously I'm really interested actually in the last panel of the day today, and but it's this whole question, what is our agency, or how are we seen as the agency that we inhabit? What can we reach? What are we allowed to reach? And we all operate with a certain code of language and experience and agency. And there is the whole kind of former Austro-Hungarian Empire. Somehow the roots went down so far that we feel, loads of us feel very similarly. So I guess the artistic practices kind of have more of an audience in terms of who we can reach.
So when you say we, you say we artists from the Western Balkans feel at home here.
Yeah.
At the heart of the former Habsburg Empire, that those cultural roots.
Which wasn't, honestly, I can tell you 20 years ago, it didn't feel like that. But also there is this...
Is that because Austria's changed, do you think?
I think also our perception of having to be this sort of, tropes of trauma artists has changed. So it feels that now we are liberated to speak the language, which is kind of also much more universal, but it's also... that idea of these migrations and this constantly shifting borders has become even more universal than it was. And of course, we're looking at this kind of transitory spaces where, everything is so mixed. And, also then the projects that are coming out are incredibly rich in complexity. And there's a difference, and this is what I think also, the cultural institutions in Britain don't get. There's a difference between complexity and complication. And here, you can be multi-layered. And, here it feels, to me at least, and maybe, grass is always greener, but it feels that, there are no wrong audiences. The expectation is that, everybody can be an audience, which is, we're starting to lose that. I mean, in Britain, for example, Baltic that you mentioned is incredible because, we need to continue to make sure that people feel comfortable in entering museums and galleries and that they don't feel that they are not for them. And, the Western Balkans, unfortunately, we lost our audiences. This is very problematic in all of our museums of contemporary art because we somehow over-intellectualized our production.
So it's, yes, because I was interested in Graz that a lot of the art is outside and in kind of ordinary buildings. So it is, and it's all free at this festival. So there is a real effort, isn't there, to actually bring art into different areas of the city. And I think you see that in Vienna as well. And are you saying that, say, in places like the UK now, it's much more about, not sort of dumbing down, but kind of looking for, following the money and being much more sort of a broader, popular, accessible agenda in the art world?
I mean, it's a really strange feeling because in a strange way, what is happening in, countries in Eastern Europe or Central Eastern Europe that are kind of going more towards the right, it's actually not that different to what the UK sometimes is doing. And you use the word dumbing down, and I think actually you're not far away from that because you either do it as self-censorship because you need to tick the boxes of Arts Council, for example, in Britain. And, they want accessibility. And again, look, accessibility is not, it doesn't mean it has to be something that's just monosyllabic, right? It's about the public program you create around it. It's about the workshop. It's about bringing kids to engage with it, right? And, when I look at Poland has now, this whole idea of this accessibility, the word accessibility has been really, really abused, basically. So they kind of want to make things accessible. That means that, so when I wanted to show my film The Gift in Museum Sztuki in Łódź, we just about got away from this bill becoming a law, which was, they basically wanted to make a new video that was explaining my video, which would be installed next to it. And, this is what I think that, you need clever institutions, you need directors that will, that will be able to stand up against these things or find very clever ways around it, I think. So you continue with the complexity.
Now, I think it's time for questions. So has anyone got a question for Jasmina? Yeah, well, several. So I tell you what we could do is actually we could take 3 at once. That's often quite a good way, and then you can answer them all. Yeah, so this gentleman first.
Thank you. I agree as a software developer with your notion that complexity does not equate complication. But I'd be curious, why do you think so? Could you elaborate on this, please? Thanks.
Okay, next one.
Hi, I think your area of artistic inquiry is really fascinating, and I'd like to understand if you identify as an activist artist, if that's a label that resonates for you, and if that's the case, who do you define as your audience for the work?
And then behind you, okay.
Yeah, my question is pretty similar to that last one in that you mentioned how art and culture are often implicit in power, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on protest art or activist art.
Okay, well, thank you so much. All great questions. So let's start with the complexity one then. What did you mean by that?
I guess it's the most multiplicity of levels that you pack in there, you know, and just like keeping the space. It's a bit like, I mean, I always say, you know, it's a bit like reading a novel, you know? When you read a book, it might not be for you and you put it on the shelf and you can return to it. Or maybe because of reading that novel, you go to another one. And somehow people don't seem to think like that about art. And, you know, it's very much more about like, oh, I get it or I don't get it. But this getting it, what does that mean? You know, what does getting art mean? I mean, you know, I see exhibitions and I have my own reading, and I still remember always, you know, my grandmother was my favorite audience. You know, I always kind of took my grandmother in to see the show, and you know, and she once said, yeah, I have no idea, but I love the colors. But she was really, you know, just really sitting there and really soaking it in. And
Which is
okay.
fine, isn't it?
It's totally okay. I don't understand nuclear physics, you know? It's fine, it's different people. And I think it's like levels of like entry, and you can kind of return to things. And I think that's the problem, because, you know, if you kind of, you know, if you get scared, I think it's mostly to do with the selection committees. And biennials, again, are like a really good example of that, of like, oh, you know, will the audience get it? And a lot of the times it's to do with how much time people spend with it. And time, I think, is something that, you know, it has become so, I mean, tokenistic also, no? You know, I mean, what does it mean? And can we take the time, and can we spend it? Anyway, so this is, I guess, where I'm going. And then, yeah, in terms of activism, and I mean, it's a really good question, because I think I'm personally revisiting that myself, how I feel. So I actually started with a performative practice. I worked with 3 other women artists, and we were doing performances on board trains when they were passing national borders. And we dressed up as a non-existent I would say custom officers, probably the best thing to kind of you get an idea in your head. And we were doing this like very nonsensical performances of giving out hygiene kits. So this is, what was this? Was maybe 2000? And it was mostly like Italian-Slovenian border. So you would have these trains where you would still have like the top of the train would open, and like migrants would jump down and like run through the train. So it was still quite a very tense border, and I was studying in Italy at the time. And we didn't have visas, because there was something that, you know, the Italian embassy and the Slovenian embassy just didn't kind of figure out. So wherever you went to the line to stand in Marghera, you know, it was like the line of the African and Eastern European migrants, and the line was very long, and they made us wait in the rain. So we never got this permesso di soggiorno, basically. Which is, yeah, I'm just figuring out, this is recorded, so, okay, erase that, strike that. My legal student years. But yeah, so we were doing, but what was really fascinating was that this idea of hygiene as this exchange factor between East and West was very fascinating for me. Also the question of what is an artist? Are we gatekeepers? Are we experience givers? And I guess that informed my practice a lot. But then also, you know, within performative work, I went very quickly into the delegation of performativity. So I started then working with the actual people who inhabited the spaces of power and not my own body. And then I was kind of thought, okay, this is actually, it's still art, you know. I didn't consider it activism, probably because the system was existent. And, you know, we could do these things, you know, with permissions, supported by museums and so on. And I found my sort of, let's say, kind of more political activism actually outside, and I kind of do other things. So I kind of like very clearly divorced those two. But recently, I am revisiting this, because I think just that the action of staying within the production of culture in itself is political activism.
Question here?
Making art accessible. and there's like a line, as you said, like a thin line about over-explaining, but also making it possible for people that don't have the background information needed to fully immerse yourself within the art and like get it, as you said. How do you make it possible for people that don't have the context, that don't get the option to understand all the behind workings that you made, that like information that you researched before you made your exhibitions or installations, without over-explaining yourself?
Yeah, no, it's a perfect question. And, you know, but again, I think there's, you know, with other fields, like, you know, we would never ask a chemist to explain how they arrived to, you know, the equation. And, you know, whenever we do artist talks, you know, in our field, like we kind of like really, you know, bring everything out and we kind of like really explain the entirety of like the, you know, the intestines, if you want, you know. But it's a bit like, you know, any field, I think. And I think just with art, there is this idea of, again, back to like, you know, getting it, you know, and needing to know everything. And I'm looking at my 14-year-old daughter, right, and how she learns. So how we learned was, you know, we had a textbook and you had to learn the textbook, and that was what was then asked at the exam. And you kind of thought, okay, everything was packaged in for you. So you kind of had this idea of knowledge as something fixed. And how my daughter learns is like something's in the cloud, something's online, something's maybe scribbled somewhere. But let's say her idea of what knowledge is or what understanding of a subject matter is just so much more open and so much freer and lovelier, you know, and she, again, for every field this goes. And I think, you know, with art, there's this idea because, you know, we come to these projects wanting to understand everything. But, you know, you drive a car, you don't know how the engine is necessarily done and brought together. Some people feel that they need to, do you know what I mean? And it's okay to have your own reading of it. But then in terms of the whole, you know, kind of making things accessible, that is, of course, that is a thing. And I mean, back to the Baltic, you know, what the Baltic has been really brilliant with is, you know, just asking the audiences, how do they feel? And I think, you know, this whole, like, the conversation with the audiences is just so important, you know, of just listening to them and, you know, listening to their suggestions, because also, like, it's to do also with the space and the context and the work itself. And, you know, how it makes them feel. Because, of course, you know, nobody wants to be made feel stupid, right? But you don't have to over-explain. And again, I'm a super fan of public programs and workshops, and yeah.
Question here.
Thank you. Jasmina, this has been great. And KIRSTY, you're an amazing moderator, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
This has been really excellent. My question is this. In my work, I'm interested in the ways in which ideas and culture intersect. And I'm fascinated by the aesthetics of, as you call, the real third way. And I have a particular passion for that third way architecture, whether in Belgrade or the Oscar Niemeyer that you mentioned, and the kind of high modernism that was represented by the non-aligned at one time. Are you interested at all in how the new and emerging non-aligned is being represented aesthetically as well, whether in places like, I don't know, Dubai or Rio or Jakarta? Maybe it's too early to talk about the aesthetics of the bricks or the new non-aligned, but I would find it to be a really interesting comparative project to look at the modernism of Bandung 55 and the, I don't know what you call it, postmodernism of the emerging non-aligned in 2023. I'm wondering any thoughts you might have on that.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, it's, you know, there's this like really interesting moment when kind of architecture, or like say like power architecture, power brokers, they become scared of nationalism in aesthetics. And then they just kind of go, whoop. And then they kind of put this role onto the art that then they put into the offices and so on, right? So this fear of nationalism in the architecture itself is like particularly European. And you kind of have, I mean, you could even call it like Brussels aesthetic in a weird way, right? And then you kind of look at these other situations where they're not scared, they're going for it. So, and I mean, back to Geneva, for example. So what is happening with the gifts in the Palace of Nations they're literally falling apart now. So, you know, this 1930s frescoes and foyers are basically falling apart. So what they're doing is, I mean, it's also money related, obviously, but it's also very clever ideologically because they're just kind of like letting new gift givers come in. So there's two, I don't know if you've seen the photos, there's two new halls that have been recently done. One is done by UAE and one by Qatar. And, you know, it's the carpet in a color of a sand with the dunes and white chairs that looks like Bedouins in the desert. And you know, this scenographic tropes that are coming in are just extremely fascinating. So it's, it's a brilliant case study.
They've got a question there and then Ivan afterwards, yeah. I think you've just given her a new idea. Next project.
Thank you. I was really fascinated by the ways you talk about cultural diplomacy. And I know that it's a very, very difficult thing to negotiate, how to put your ideas, your aesthetics in the public space for discussion, as you say, and then at the same time be beholden to those who made it possible for you. Now, that fascinates me. But I have been myself an activist in the public space trying to do it as the gift giver who mobilizes others who do not want to be commissioned. What can you tell us about a lot of these people, including, for instance, I mobilize street artists to come into public spaces like cafes and restaurants. There are people who will come up for discussions later on, but there are others also who will probably not give any kind of recognition. That's very, very difficult for artists. Now, I'd like to ask you from your own experience, because there are a lot of them, I'm sure, in the UK and around ex-Yugoslavia, I've seen myself, who have been trying to get there out in the public space, gifting their artistic interventions and without feeling any recognition at all.
Actually, I'll take that second question as well from Ivan, and then you can answer them both at the same time. So we, the other Ivan. Oh, did you both Ivans then? Oh, this Ivan, yeah. Okay. Did you have your hand up as well? No, okay.
Ivan Vejvoda with the Institute for Human Sciences, otherwise from Belgrade. Thank you really for a fascinating presentation. And this is sort of more of a comment. You probably know that Mila Turajlic did this movie on the non-aligned movement, so there's a movement out there to recuperate some of this, and I think that's very interesting. Secondly, just a tiny pushback, not everything is falling apart in the archives. The Museum of Yugoslavia in Belgrade, for example, has a team of young women curators that are doing fantastic work, and in fact, recently, Jelena Micic, who is now the curator of the WIEN Woche, did a fantastic exhibition on the shoe factory Leda from her birth town, Knjaževac, where her father and grandfather worked, that had relations with Africa, that really fantastic. For those who are interested, she did a nice catalog. And the Museum of Yugoslavia, which is of course a bringback from the old times, has been revitalized. Or I take, for example, the presentation at the Venice Architecture Biennale with the exhibition of Svetlana Kana-Radević. This architect, her whole archive was presented there, terrific work. And what's interesting, when the MoMA exhibition on the Yugoslav architecture was, I showed it to an American friend, and her comment was, wow, it's fascinating how many women you see in these architectural bureaus. You'd never see that in an American bureau in the 50s and 60s. So what I'm saying is, I think there are not only capillary, but other efforts to actually, and not only in Belgrade, but Zagreb, Sarajevo, and as you mentioned, Titograd, now Podgorica. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, Museum of Yugoslavia is like the one institution that is like a pride and joy of us all, and they are like incredibly good, and Radovan has done an amazing job on digitization of everything. So I was referring to the Archive of Yugoslavia, and also the Richter collection that Vesna Meštrić was looking after. And when my grandfather passed away, we, for example, didn't know where to put all of his archives because we were like so scared of where, you know, who's going to take care of them. So, you know, I've been mostly working with Vlada Kulic and Jelica Jovanovic and all the architects in kind of like trying to kind of get this access and protect the things that were being lost. And for example, in terms of the Podgorica archive, I mean, it looks like it's okay now, but they were threatened to be closed. So this was an archive that was closed for 30 years. And it was unpopular. They didn't know what to do with it. They were embarrassed by it. I mean, obviously not the women working there, but, you know, the directors. And Natalia Vuješević was the first artist curator who managed to open it, and she brought it to Venice. So this was, you know, this was kind of why we really wanted to work with it really quickly, because so Pompidou Center, I mean, and it's fine, these things are opened, of course, but my major fear is this, we were mentioning it a lot, this geopolitical exoticism, you know, that things are taken as ready-made, and these are not ready-mades, you know, they need to be, and Mila Turalic, an amazing filmmaker, if you guys are interested, I mean, she does amazing documentaries, really drawn from the non-aligned archives, and, you know, she's a total inspiration and amazing. Anna Janeus-Kedmoma has been also great in showing her work and so on. But this is all this generation of my age, so like, you know, between 40 and 50-year-old people, and it's mostly architects and artists who are now, and it was a weird one, we were actually doing an exhibition in Belgrade with Una Popovic and Lina Đuverović, and at some point, you know, we were kind of sitting there going like, we are the 3 granddaughters of the builders of Yugoslavia. So,
yeah, just say who your grandfather was.
My grandfather was Dragutin Ivanović. He was actually in the Yugoslav military, and he retired the first day when he knew Yugoslavia would fall apart. And then he was working as a historian, building basically monuments to his fallen partisan comrades.
And so can you just answer this gentleman's questions about the gift?
So, in terms of, you know, as an artist, when you want to engage with any reality and any sort of, you know, any external communication, I think it really is just about the intent and communicating the intent. And, you know, people, as we were talking about a lot today, like people, I was talking a lot about today, but people are scared of art and they don't know what to do with it. But I always quote, I have one really dear friend who's actually a trained artist, but she now works as a photographer. And she's one of the very few artists I know. So she does gifts, basically. She takes books from the libraries and she makes watercolors and she puts them back in and she returns them to the libraries. Nobody ever knows it's her. Nobody ever, you know, gets anything else but the artwork. And it's beautiful, I think.
That's lovely. Well, I think I think that's all the questions. So probably, no, actually, I think we've run out of time. One more question. We've got 2 minutes left. Yeah, go on.
Do you think cultural diplomacy is successful in building better relations between nations and countries and within international organizations? Do everyday people feel the effect of cultural diplomacy, and it's not just that a nation exhibits one time in another country? Does it really have a substantial effect?
I think it can. I think it really can. And I guess, you know, as, you know, coming from a very small country, a lot of the times, you know, it's, you know, who can we call to, you know, be our representative, you know, and I'm a lot of the times that person. So, you know, I'm trying to reverse the game a little bit and say, look, if you do that, you need to, I mean, it's back to the whole kind of reciprocity of gift, right? So if I'm representing something, then, you know, whoever I'm representing also has a responsibility. And I think it's about, you know, holding cultural diplomacy accountable, but making them understand their potential power. And unfortunately, you know, it's the big countries, whatever that means, they do realize that, but it's probably because they have more skilled people around the talking tables that are also trained in art history and, you know, other things that can actually represent the artist. And unfortunately, you know, the Western Balkans, we many times fall flat on that. But it must not be like that, you know, and I think we can really reinvent things. And there are some amazing people, you know, fighting our corner. And, you know, I just try to, you know, create these rolling snowballs when we can then together activate these maybe sometimes sleepy nooks into progressive action.
But I mean, that subject of soft power is something I think we could discuss for hours, actually, in all sorts of aspects. I think it's a really fascinating subject. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Jasmina Cibic, thank you so much for a really fascinating talk.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you. Thank you.